Hello, everyone, and welcome. The other day, I was speaking to my niece on the phone. She's 4 years old, and she asked me this question: why can't I hear the voice of Jesus? So, when I heard this question first coming from my little niece, I was caught off guard a little bit, and then I started to ask some follow up questions to figure out why she was thinking this. And it turns out that she'd heard somewhere that we all should be listening to the voice of Jesus. And she was getting very concerned that she couldn't hear Jesus' voice because she expected to hear Jesus' voice just as she'd be talking to someone in a regular conversation. Now, I was so taken aback by this question, I don't know exactly how I answered it. I think I tried to explain that, yeah, we definitely hear Jesus' voice in our life, but we don't hear Jesus' voice in the same way as you and I are talking right now. We hear Jesus' voice through other people when we read the Bible. We hear Jesus' voice sometimes in the thoughts that we get in prayer, and so on. But since she's raised this question with me, I've been thinking about it. How do we hear Jesus' voice? And I was considering the example of the Bible, about how people in the Bible listened for God's voice. And I was struck by how people listened for God's voice, especially at difficult situations, really tragic situations in the history of Israel, were times where people tried in a particular way to hear God's voice. So when things got difficult, when things were hard, when they were persecuted, they would often ask themselves this question: what is God trying to tell us through all of this? What message is God trying to deliver to us through this difficulty, through this struggle? How is God calling us to change our life? How is God showing us that He is really with us here and now? A great example of this we can find is during the time of the Exile. So around the year 586 BC, the Babylonian Empire destroyed Jerusalem, they destroyed the temple, and they took the elite into exile in Babylon. This was a very difficult, trying, and traumatic time for the people of Judah. And at this time, they asked themselves, what is God saying to us? They tried to listen for God's voice in the midst of this tragedy. And then in the different biblical texts, we find different answers to this question. For example, in the book of Kings, we find that the author thinks that this tragedy, this kind of cataclysmic event that has come upon his people, is a result of their sins. They've turned away from God, and God is kind of rebuking them so that they can turn back to Him again. In the prophet Isaiah, we find a somewhat different answer, a different way that Isaiah saw God speaking to the people. Isaiah saw this time of difficulty and struggle as a time of renewal. Isaiah preached a very hopeful message that in the midst of this tragedy, God was bringing about something new. He was renewing the covenant with His people. During these difficult and trying times, people in the Bible, in the biblical texts, would inquire, to search, to see what is God saying to us here and now? What is He trying to teach us? We've begun today Advent. Today is the first Sunday of Advent, and Advent really is a season in which we are trying to be watchful, to search, to inquire, to have this same spirit that the people in the Bible showed, to ask ourselves always, what is God saying to us? To ask that question that my niece asked, what is Jesus saying to me here and now? The spirit of watchfulness is very, very important. And we see this come across quite strongly in the gospel for today. So the gospel for today is taken from Mark chapter 13. Jesus said to His disciples, "Beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts his slaves in charge, each with a particular task, and commands the doorkeeper to be on the watch. Therefore keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or at dawn, or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. And what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake." Advent is a time for us to keep awake, to keep watchful. We wait not only for Jesus to come at Christmas, we wait not only for Jesus to come at the end of time, but we want to be watchful for the small ways or big ways that Jesus speaks to us, that He enters our life here and now, each and every day. We've started this season of Advent really in a very unique time, a very difficult time, this time of the pandemic, a trying time. Like the people in the Bible who lived through difficult situations, we should perhaps really focus on this attitude of watchfulness, especially during an Advent, during a pandemic, to ask ourselves, what is Jesus trying to tell us in the midst of this pandemic? We certainly should have hope that it will end, but we should also ask ourselves here and now, what is God trying to tell us through all of this? What is He trying to reveal to us? What ways is He calling us as individuals and as a society to change? This is really something Pope Francis has been thinking a lot about and has been writing a lot about. Pope Francis recently released an encyclical called Fratelli Tutti, and in this encyclical, he argues that the COVID pandemic has kind of laid bare all the difficulties that we've been experiencing in our society and in our hearts for some times. Difficulties like polarization, inequality, loneliness, a fracturing of society, a growing sense of aggressiveness and violence, a lack of kindness. And Pope Francis argues that in this pandemic, we have an opportunity to follow Jesus anew, to listen to Jesus' voice, and to try to build a world that is marked more by fraternity, where we see all people as our brothers and sisters, to focus on what is most important in our life, the different relationships we have with others around us, but also with God, to turn once again to God in our life. So as we begin this Advent season, now in a very unique and difficult and trying time. But it is really an opportunity for us, just as those authors in the Old Testament asked themselves at very tragic times, what is God saying to me here and now? So we too can ask ourselves the same question. During this pandemic, during this time of COVID, what is the voice of Jesus saying to me? What is the voice of Jesus saying to our community? What is God trying to teach us? What is He trying to tell us? We need to be watchful. How is God perhaps focusing us on what is most important in our life? As all these things are taken away from us, which relationships are most important with people around us, with God? And also, it's a chance for us kind of to realize that maybe some things in our life were not so important. Some things in our life were not leading us to God and greater love of neighbor. Let us then follow Christ's example in the gospel today and really kind of try to have that same desire that my niece had, to try to listen for Jesus' voice every day, but especially during an Advent during the pandemic. God bless you and take care.